It is early 2026. Public markets still quote confidence, central banks still issue reassurances, and cash still appears liquid. Yet behind closed doors, a different behavior dominates. Billionaires are dumping cash and buying land, not startups, not equities, not innovation narratives, dirt. This is not diversification, it is an evacuation. Land is not purchased at the end of stable systems. It is accumulated at the end of monetary credibility. When those closest to the mechanism abandon currency, they are not making a bet. They are settling accounts before the rules change. Cash dies first in every collapse. Currency is a promise. It functions only while trust holds. When debasement accelerates, currency stops being a store of value and becomes a liability. It is no longer neutral. It actively decays. Those who understand this do not argue with policy. They reposition. This is why land cannot be printed. Land cannot be diluted. Land cannot be erased by accounting. It is the oldest form of settlement because it sits beneath every system layered on top of it. When currency fails, control reverts downward, not upward. Ownership of physical ground becomes the final claim. This behavior is always misinterpreted. Media calls it inflation hedging. Analysts call it long-term vision. Politicians call it confidence in the future. None of those explanations survive arithmetic. You do not lock capital into immobile, illiquid assets if you expect stability. You do it when you expect volatility to become permanent. The shift is global: farmland, water rights, timber, energy corridors, strategic acreage near logistics routes. These are not lifestyle purchases. They are balance sheet exits from paper systems. This is stage 4 behavior. When the mechanism activates, assets are no longer evaluated by return. They are evaluated by survivability. Cash fails that test first because it depends entirely on policy restraint. Policy restraint no longer exists. The public misses this signal because nothing looks broken yet. Accounts still update, ATMs still function, markets still trade. That is how late-stage systems always appear. The transition is quiet until it is irreversible. Those buying land are not predicting collapse dates. They are responding to structure. They understand that once debasement becomes the only viable policy tool, holding currency is mathematically irrational. This is not fear-driven behavior. It is informed behavior. Every major monetary reset begins this way. Before Rome imposed grain taxes in kind. Before Weimar paid workers twice a day. Before 1971 severed gold. Those with proximity to power converted paper into ground. The same migration is happening now. Billionaires are not buying dirt because they believe in growth. They are buying it because they no longer believe in money. The thesis: why cash dies first. Cash is not neutral in late-stage systems. It is the first asset to fail because it is the most exposed to policy. When debasement becomes the primary tool of survival, holding currency is no longer conservative. It is dangerous. History follows a fixed 4-stage cycle because monetary systems all confront the same constraint. Claims cannot outgrow reality forever. Stage 1 is hard constraint and trust. Money is anchored. Gold, silver, land rents, or productive output enforce discipline. Currency holds purchasing power because expansion is limited. Cash functions as a reliable store of value. Saving is rewarded. Planning is rational. Planning. Stage 2 is expansion and abstraction. Success invites leverage. Credit grows faster than production. Financial instruments multiply. Currency issuance increases, but confidence remains intact. Cash still works because dilution is gradual and largely invisible. This phase is mistaken for stability. Stage 3 is distortion and dependency. Debt service overtakes productivity. Policymakers intervene to prevent collapse. Liquidity replaces liquidation. Currency creation accelerates to preserve asset values and social order. At this point, cash stops being a store value and becomes a wasting asset. Purchasing power erodes even as nominal balances rise. Stage 4 is the reset. The system cannot honor promises in real terms. It does not announce failure, it manages it. Inflation replaces default. Controls replace transparency. Cash absorbs the adjustment because it is the easiest claim to dilute. The loss is universal but uneven. This is where the system is now. Once stage 4 begins, holding cash is mathematically impossible to justify as preservation. Every new unit issued reduces the value of all existing units. This is not speculation. It is arithmetic. The mechanism requires dilution to continue because restraint would collapse the structures now dependent on expansion. This is why those closest to the system exit cash first. They understand that currency is a promise backed by political restraint. Political restraint disappears when survival is at stake. At that moment, cash is no longer liquidity. It is exposure. Land, by contrast, is settlement. It exists outside the promise layer. It does not depend on central banks, clearing systems, or rollover markets. It does not reprice because of policy decisions made overnight. The mistake is believing that cash is safe because it is liquid. In late-stage systems, liquidity is the trap. It allows value to be drained silently. This is not a preference shift. It is a structural necessity. Cash dies first because it must. And once that reality is accepted, the move into land stops looking optional. Historical proof, the rule of three. The movement from cash into land is not a modern phenomenon. It is the oldest response to debasement recorded in economic history. Whenever currency loses credibility, those with foresight abandon abstract claims and secure physical control. This pattern appears with such consistency that calling it coincidence is no longer credible. Rome, Weimar Germany, and the post-1971 monetary order demonstrate the mechanism in full. Rome is the first proof. Rome's monetary authority rested on the silver denarius. Its power came from consistency. The coin contained real metal accepted across the empire for wages, trade, and taxes. Trust was not ideological. It was enforced by weight. As long as the denarius held integrity, cash functioned as a reliable claim. Expansion destroyed that balance. Military campaigns multiplied. Borders expanded. Infrastructure costs hardened. Political loyalty required payment. Taxation reached its ceiling. Rome faced a constraint it could not politically accept: contraction. The alternative was debasement. Under Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius was reduced. The coin looked unchanged. Its face value was enforced by law. The public was told nothing fundamental had shifted. But the measuring stick was altered. That single act set the process in motion. Debasement accelerated across successive emperors. Each reduction funded temporary stability while permanently damaging trust. By the 3rd century, Rome introduced the Antoninianus, officially valued at 2 denarii while containing far less than double the silver. This was not monetary innovation. It was an admission that cash no longer represented value. Prices adjusted immediately. Soldiers demanded more coins. Merchants raised prices defensively. Contracts shortened. Savings lost meaning. The state responded with enforcement instead of restoration. Taxes were demanded in harder terms while wages were paid in debased currency. Value did not disappear. It moved. Those closest to power exited cash early. Senators and elites accumulated land, grain stores, and production rights. Land became the dominant form of security because it generated food, rent, and leverage independent of currency integrity. The public held coins that lost value daily. Rome did not experience a fair redistribution. It experienced extraction followed by concentration. The Roman lesson is clear. When cash is diluted, land becomes the final claim. Weimar Germany is the second proof. In 1923, Germany faced reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks. Gold marks were not symbolic units. They represented fixed metal weight. Germany did not possess the reserves required to pay. The obligation was mathematically impossible to meet through production or taxation. The state chose printing. Initially, the response appeared successful. Wages were paid, businesses operated, equity prices surged, nominal wealth exploded. And to the public, it looked like recovery. In reality, it was the currency collapsing faster than prices could adjust. As printing accelerated, velocity followed. Holding cash became irrational. Prices rose not because of panic, but because the unit of account failed. Bread moved from 160 marks to billions, then hundreds of billions. Savings were obliterated. Fixed incomes collapsed completely. Again, value did not vanish. It relocated. Those with access to credit converted marks into farmland, factories, inventory, and equipment. Land ownership became decisive. A farm could feed families, generate trade, and preserve power regardless of currency collapse. Urban wage earners holding cash were destroyed financially within months. The critical detail is timing. Land was accumulated before the public understood what was happening. By the time hyperinflation became undeniable, all real assets had already changed hands. The reset did not occur when prices peaked. It occurred when land ownership stabilized under new control. Weimar proves the second rule. When currency fails, land absorbs value silently and permanently. The United States and Britain after 1971 formed the third proof. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system anchored global currencies to the US dollar and the dollar to gold. This imposed discipline. Claims could not expand infinitely because settlement required metal. Cash retained meaning because constraint existed. That constraint ended on August 15, 1971, when President Nixon closed the gold window. Bretton Woods collapsed. The dollar became pure credit. This created the exorbitant privilege, the ability to issue global currency without immediate settlement. From that moment forward, cash began a long decay. Debt expanded faster than output. Asset prices rose faster than wages. Financial markets grew larger than the real economy. Saving in currency became punishment. Holding cash preserved liquidity, not purchasing power. Over decades, land and real assets outperformed not because they were productive, but because currency was being diluted. Land quietly reasserted dominance. Real estate, Farmland, mineral rights, and resource corridors became the ultimate hedge against monetary expansion. Those with access to leverage accumulated physical ground using cheap credit. Those holding cash watched purchasing power erode year after year. This is not a speculative cycle. It is structural. Once currency is unanchored, it must be expanded to sustain the system built on it. That expansion guarantees long-term decay of cash. Across all three cases, the same sequence appears. First, currency functions because it is constrained. Second, obligations exceed capacity. Third, the constraint is removed. Fourth, cash decays steadily. Finally, land becomes the dominant store of value. This is the rule of three. The reason the public consistently misses this shift is narrative. Land accumulation is framed as investment. Inflation is framed as temporary. Cash is framed as safety. These descriptions mask the underlying transfer. Those exiting cash are not predicting collapse dates. They are responding to incentives embedded in the system. They understand that once debasement becomes policy, holding currency is a guaranteed loss over time. Land does not need growth to function. It does not require confidence. It does not depend on policy restraint. It simply exists. History shows no exception to this rule. Whenever currency credibility collapses, land ownership consolidates. The reset does not begin with panic. It begins with quiet acquisition. That acquisition is already underway. The mechanism has not changed. Only the scale has. The modern trap. Land as settlement. In the modern system, land is no longer treated primarily as a productive asset. It is treated as settlement. This shift explains why billionaires are not chasing yield or innovation, but acreage, water access, and control over physical corridors. They are not investing. They are closing exposure. The trap is believing this behavior is speculative. It is not. When currency credibility erodes, settlement migrates downward. Contracts, promises, and paper claims lose priority. What remains enforceable is what exists physically and cannot be diluted. Land sits at the bottom of every financial stack. Everything else is layered on top of it. This is why land absorbs value when cash fails. In stage 4, capital is no longer deployed to maximize return. It is deployed to minimize dependency. Dependency on rollover markets, dependency on monetary policy, dependency on legal frameworks that only function while trust remains intact. Cash is the most dependent asset in existence. It depends on policy restraint. It depends on institutional stability. It depends on confidence that tomorrow's unit will resemble today's. Land depends on none of these. Modern elites understand this distinction because they operate inside the system. They see how quickly rules change under stress. They see how emergency measures become permanent. They see how inflation is chosen repeatedly over default. These observations lead to one conclusion. Paper claims will be sacrificed to preserve structure. This is why the type of land matters. Farmland is accumulated not for yield, but for food security and leverage. Water rights are acquired because water cannot be substituted or printed. Timberland is secured because it represents energy, construction, and strategic input simultaneously. Logistics adjacent land is purchased because control of movement matters when systems fragment. These are not lifestyle assets. They are post-currency assets. The public is encouraged to view this as inequality or opportunism. That framing is convenient. It avoids confronting the underlying reality. The monetary system is no longer stable enough to hold value reliably. When that happens, rational actors move into assets that survive resets. The modern trap is that most people cannot follow. Land is illiquid, regulated and increasingly inaccessible. Zoning, capital requirements, and institutional access prevent broad participation. This ensures that the shift concentrates ownership rather than distributing it. The result is not a fair transfer, it is consolidation. This mirrors every historical case. In Rome, land ownership consolidated among elites as currency failed. In Weimar, farmland changed hands before hyperinflation was recognized. After 1971, real estate and resource assets quietly outperformed cash for decades. The difference now is speed and scale. Global capital moves instantly. Policy reacts in real time. Debasement spreads across borders simultaneously. This accelerates the migration into land and physical control. What took generations now takes years. The system cannot reverse this trend without restoring currency discipline. That option no longer exists. Discipline would collapse debt structures, asset prices, and political legitimacy simultaneously. The choice has already been made, so the system manages decline instead. Inflation is normalized, costs become permanent, cash loses function quietly, land absorbs the remainder. This is why billionaires are not waiting for confirmation. By the time confirmation arrives, acquisition is no longer possible. Land does not need belief, it only needs title. The public continues to debate markets. The insiders settle. This is the modern trap, mistaking land accumulation for confidence when it is actually preparation. The migration from cash to dirt is not a trend. It is the system revealing what it no longer protects. The last claim. Every monetary system ends by revealing what it truly protects. In the final phase, that protection no longer extends to currency. It extends to structure. Land sits at the center of that structure because it cannot be diluted, reissued, or erased by policy. This is why the shift into dirt is so decisive. Cash does not fail loudly. It fails by becoming unusable as a store of value. It still circulates. It still settles transactions. But it no longer preserves time, labor, or security. Once that function is lost, holding currency becomes exposure, not safety. The elites exiting cash are not making moral judgments. They are responding to incentives embedded in stage 4 systems. They understand that once debasement becomes permanent, the reset expresses itself through consolidation of physical claims. This is paper versus physical resolving. Land represents the final claim because it sits beneath every legal and financial layer. When currencies reset, when accounting is rewritten, when obligations are renegotiated, land remains. Control of ground determines access to food, water, energy, and movement. The Great Reset is not a single event. It is a sequence of silent decisions. Those decisions are already visible. Billionaires are not buying land because they expect prosperity. They are buying it because they no longer trust money to survive the system that depends on destroying it. Subscribe to Epoch Atlas to understand how these cycles repeat, how debasement works, and why history always resolves in favor of what cannot be printed. This is not pessimism, it is structure.